Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today we're here to talk about what I've been reading over the last decade. I've seen a few different versions of best books of the decade videos from various other booktubers. Mine is going to be probably most similar to the video that Books and Lala did. It's mostly going to be like a reflection on the things that I read in the past decade and touching on the ones that I found really memorable and were my favorites. So this has nothing to do with when the books were published, which was some of the versions of this video that I saw. I really went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to do this video, but in the end I decided I really wanted to because it will give me a chance to talk about some of my favorite books and series that I read pre-online reviewing, which I started my book blog in the fall of 2014 and I started my booktube channel in the fall of 2015. And this video would give me a chance to talk about some of my favorites from those years that you guys might not be familiar with. This was a really hard list to make. It's still quite long, but I did remove a few things that I put on it originally and some of the things that I originally put on the list after looking up some publication dates and using context clues. I realized I had read prior to 2010. So I was a little sad because I wanted to mention those books because they were very memorable to me, but I didn't read them in this decade, so I took them out of this list. I may or may not do another video talking about all of the books that I read prior to 2010, including the ones I remember reading and enjoying when I was like in elementary and middle school, and then high school and college, because 2010 is the year that I graduated from undergrad. The hardest part about this video was remembering when I read different books, so having my graduation from college be like a dividing point made things a little bit easier, but I still am really fuzzy on when exactly I read some of these things. So I'm not going to be giving you exact years or anything. We're just going to be going from the things that I remember reading earliest to the things that I read more recently. I wish my memories of exactly when I read some of these books was more fresh or more reliable. It's so fuzzy when you go back 10 years, at least for me. Part of that is definitely the fact that I wasn't using Goodreads until I started book blogging in 2014. So I have a really good record of everything that I've read from the end of 2014 until now. But everything before 2014, I just relied on my memory of, and my memory is just not that great when you go that far back. Like I said, I have quite the large list, and I'm really not going to be going into like a synopsis or anything. This is definitely more of a list video where I'm just touching on the books that really left an impact on me over the last 10 years. So like I said, I was graduating college, my undergrad, in 2010, and I went directly to grad school afterwards. I have a master's degree in something called genetic counseling. So this period of my life, I was definitely really busy, but I still found time to read, especially during my breaks from school. And it was fairly easy for me to remember what books I read during this time period because to attend grad school, I moved to Salt Lake City. And for a lot of these, I can remember where I was when I was reading them, like my apartment in Salt Lake City, so I know that that's when I read them. So here are some of the books that I remember reading and really enjoying during that time period, 2010 to 2012, maybe a little bit into 2013. I know during these years I read most of the series The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel by Michael Scott. This is a YA kind of like urban fantasy series that I still think about to this day because I never finished the very last book in the series. I think one time I went to Barnes & Noble and I was there for like an hour and I sat down and read like 100 pages of the last book in the series, but I never finished it, and I'm still kicking myself over it. This series is a lot of fun because it incorporates gods from all different myths and religions all into one world, and there's also like ley lines and stuff and magical twins. I really love this series, and I think I might one day go back and reread them. I'm not sure if they'll live up to my memories when I do, but it's definitely a series that has left a lasting impact on me. Another YA fantasy series that I read during that time period was the Bartimaeus series by Jonathan Stroud. This is a trilogy, and it has to do with a djinn or genie. I have really fond memories of this series. I was actually reminded of it a lot when I read Sorcery of Thorns last year, and I want to try more Jonathan Stroud. He has a series that's kind of like horror, or maybe it's urban fantasy, the Lockwood & Co. series that I definitely want to check out. This was also the time period where I discovered The Hunger Games. I have a very specific memory of reading the first book. I had bought the ebook on my Kindle before going to a babysitting gig, and after the kids had gone to bed, I read for like 2.5 hours until the parents came home. And I was so hooked on The Hunger Games that I went home and I stayed up until like 6 in the morning to read as much of that book as I could, and then I didn't quite finish it, but I went to sleep, woke up, and continued reading until I did finish it the next day. Obviously, this is a really popular series, but when I picked it up, I actually hadn't heard that much about it, but it was after all 3 books had been published because I was able to binge all 3 books in a short amount of time. And that's definitely one of my fondest reading memories I have from this time period. During grad school is also when I read Game of Thrones. The first season of Game of Thrones aired in 2011, and before that I hadn't heard of this series at all, but after thoroughly enjoying the first season of the show, I picked up the books and I read all 5 of them in like a summer. And I haven't reread them since then. I do plan to reread them eventually, but I am trying to wait until the series is completed, if that's ever gonna happen. The next series I kind of debated whether or not to include in this list because I'm not really sure if it was a favorite, but I do have some really fond memories of reading the first 3 books in the series, and that is the Magic Kingdom of Landover series by Terry Brooks. This is a fantasy comedy series, and it's probably the only fantasy comedy that I've ever read. Like, I haven't read any Terry Pratchett or anything like that, but I believe it's kind of similar to that. I know I laughed a lot while reading the series, but it's about a guy who comes across an ad in the newspaper for a Magic Kingdom being for sale, and he's kind of like not happy in his life and looking for a change. So he follows up with the ad thinking that it's some sort of joke, but in the end he actually does buy a Magic Kingdom, and it's about his adventures in the Magic Kingdom. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's really a favorite, but I have fond memories of reading it, and it definitely was an important part of what I was reading when I was in grad school. Another series that I remember reading at the very end of while I was in grad school, that was the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. So that was the first time that I read the trilogy, was around 2012, but of course last year I also reread this trilogy, and it definitely lived up to my memories and remains a favorite. Another series I remember enjoying while I was in grad school is another YA series. It's the Books of Bayern series by Shannon Hale. The first book in the series, I believe there's 4 total, but the first book is The Goose Girl, which I had originally read when I was in high school, but then I kind of rediscovered that and the rest of the series while I was in grad school. I know the first book, The Goose Girl, is a retelling of a fairy tale. I'm not sure if the rest of the books are, but I do remember that the magic system and world in these books was really cool. And I haven't read any Shannon Hale since then, but she's definitely an author that I have been thinking about trying again. Okay, so then I graduated from grad school in 2012, and between 2012 and the end of 2014, when I started my book blog, I really didn't do a lot of reading. I had a lot of life changes happening. I was graduating from grad school. I moved back home to the state of Texas after having lived in Salt Lake City for 2.5 years. And then I started looking for my first real job in my career field, and then I found that job and I moved halfway across the country to California. So I was really busy during that time period, and I don't really remember specifically any books that I read and loved during that time. So now that brings us to 2014 when I started book blogging. I started book blogging not that long after I discovered that book blogs existed. I had no idea before this that there was a whole community of people online who talked books. So I spent a lot of the end of 2014 and 2015 reading things that were on people's best of lists from the years prior, and just kind of catching up on a lot of the online darlings from that time. One of the first series that I read after starting my book blog was the Matched series by Ali Condi, which is a YA dystopian series. And I actually really enjoyed them. I feel like they get a mixed reception, but I went into them not really knowing what to expect, and I really enjoyed the world and the characters, and I remember finding the series pretty thought-provoking. I was already a fan of dystopian at this time. Actually, that reminds me, I forgot to mention, way back at the beginning of 2010, I read a YA dystopian. It wasn't my first YA dystopian series, but I think it was like my second or third that I loved, and that was the Ugly series by Scott Westerfeld. I distinctly remember reading that series the summer after I graduated undergrad, but before I went to grad school. And it was definitely one of the series that made me fall in love with the genre or subgenre of dystopian. Anyways, fast forward to 2014, I read the Match series, really enjoyed it. But then when I started blogging, I realized that it's a series that not a lot of people really like that much. So some other series and books that I read during this little catch up to what everybody else is reading period included the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Myers, which is one of my favorite YA series. I also read The Darkest Minds, which is another like dystopian series that I also really loved, and that's by Alexandra Bracken. I read the Chaos Walking trilogy by Patrick Ness, and that is hands down one of my favorite YA series. It's a YA sci-fi series. I also read and really loved the Shadow and Bone series, which was my introduction to Leigh Bardugo, and of course since then I've also read and loved her Six of Crows duology. And then in 2016, I was reading this Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, and I love that series so much. That was my introduction to Laini Taylor, and of course I also love her Strange the Dreamer duology. 2015 is also when the Shades of Magic series started, and I read the first one, A Darker Shade of Magic, shortly after it had come out, because it was new and buzzy, and I have since then finished that trilogy, and it is one of my favorite adult fantasy series. A couple more YA fantasy series that I have loved include the Seven Realms series by Cinda Williams-Chima, definitely one of my top YA series that I have read. And also the Walk on Earth a Stranger series, is that the name of the series? That's by Ray Carson, and I only finished that trilogy last year, but I loved it so much. Another adult fantasy series that I have loved in the last few years is the Queen of the Tearling trilogy by Erica Johansson, and I am dying to read more books by her. She hasn't published anything since then, but I know she's working on something, and I will definitely be reading that when it comes out. And then there's also Uprooted and Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Those were definitely a couple of highlights from the last few years. And then in the 2017, 2018, 2019 time period, I started expanding into some other genres that I don't read so much. So a few contemporaries that I have loved include Saving Francesca by Melina Marchetta, although I think I read that more in like 2015. But that's a YA contemporary that showed me that I can really love YA contemporaries. I also discovered Celeste Ng and read Everything I Never Told You, followed by Little Fires Everywhere, and I loved both of them. I'm very much looking forward to the show, or is it a movie, that Reese Witherspoon is working on for Little Fires Everywhere. The latter part of the decade is also when I started to discover my love for horror. I do have a whole video recommending some of my favorite horror books, but some of the standouts from this time period include The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey, which is actually a duology, Bird Box by Josh Malerman, and The Troop by Nick Cutter. Within the last couple of years, I've also discovered that I really love sci-fi thrillers, so Dark Matter was probably the first sci-fi thriller that I read and adored, and since then I have also read Recursion, both by Blake Crouch, and I think those will have a lasting impact on me. And in the last few years, I also discovered the This Mortal Coil series. It's a trilogy, but I haven't read the last book, only the first two. But that's a YA sci-fi dystopian thrillery kind of book or series that I have really enjoyed, and I think they'll remain favorites for a long time. I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop here. There are probably a few more from the last couple of years that I could have included in this list, but because they're just still so close to me time-wise, I just really don't know which ones are going to stand the test of time. Plus, you guys have heard me talk about my recent favorites a lot lately, so I think it's okay if I don't go into those. Alright guys, that's a bit of a review of my last decade of reading and some of the highlights that I have had. Let me know in the comment section if you were surprised by any of these, or if any of them are also books and series that you guys have enjoyed, especially the ones that are like pre-booktube. I'd love to know if you guys have read those and love them too. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.